Everybody. This half hour on the programme, we're talking about a new book which explores the shadowy world of the secret agents, the spies, recruited by British intelligence to infiltrate the IRA and Sinn Féin during the Troubles. And some of those so-called agents of influence are now talking, some of them for the first time. The book is called Agents of Influence, Britain's Secret Intelligence War Against the IRA. We'll hear from its author in a second, Aaron Edwards, Senior Lecturer in Defence and International Affairs at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. But let me tell you who Aaron is, first of all. He's from Belfast. He took his PhD from Queen's University. His previous books, I think he's got 9 or 10 books at this point, many of them highly acclaimed. His previous books include the book UVF Behind the Mask. Many of you will know that book. We're joined live now by Aaron Edwards to find out what he's discovered in this journey into this secret world. Aaron, welcome, sir. Good afternoon. Good to talk to you again, Aaron.
Good afternoon, Will.
And we're going to take your questions as well, and we'll take your calls. You can talk directly to Aaron. It's a fascinating subject. 03030 80 55 55. If you'd rather I put a question or a point on your behalf, you can text that to 81771. Let's start with what is a very secretive world, necessarily. A shadowy and secretive world. Aaron, how do you, as an academic, an historian, a writer, how do you get into that world? How did you approach this?
I think that we have to approach these highly controversial and secretive topics in the same ways that, those intelligence officers actually went about their day-to-day business back during the real heightened tensions of the conflict. And so what they did very simply was they started to talk to people. And that's exactly what I did with this book. My last book, I spent an awful long time talking to people and obviously reading around the subject. But I really got most of the inside information from people. So talking to people and using my contacts that I've built up over 20 years to track down some of these agents was absolutely key, I think, to bringing this project to fruition.
And some of those people, for understandable reason, you've kept their identity masked.
That's correct. So several of the agents, with the exception of one, I have named. He has avowed himself. He has come out in public. He's written a memoir recently. But with the exception of him, of course, these people occupy the shadows, and that's where they stay for most of the rest of their lives. And we must remember that, of course, they do still exist in a very precarious world where they have betrayed people. And at the very center of my book is that dimension of betrayal, betraying friends, but in some cases actually betraying families. So it's, as I've said, it's controversial, and but it's a world that people, I think, are very interested in. So what I tried to do in the book Agents of Influence was really bring out the human dimension and the costs and consequences.
That former spy you mentioned, who is named and who has written his own book, Willie Carlin, whose book Thatcher's Spy we know has been out there a while. I think in your book you quote him as describing himself almost as an actor, that he was prepared to play a role, and he quite enjoyed it. He was immersed in the role. Yes,
so as I've said at a number of occasions now, in talking to people, that's really the key of this. It's sometimes referred to in the spy literature as the human factor. And when I first met Willie Carlin a few years ago now, he came across as someone quite warm and affable, and he liked to tell some very colourful stories about his time, sort of behind enemy lines, if you will. But actually, what I found is a person who was quite personable. He could get on with people, and that's exactly what his handlers required of him. They required him to extract information from people who would, under normal circumstances, not be revealing it to anyone.
Let's talk about the strategy itself. The agents of influence, or the spy, or the agents more generally, strategy of the British intelligence organisations from the very beginning. Maurice Oldfield, tell us who he is.
So Maurice Oldfield was the chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, and he retired in the late 1970s to a very quiet research position at Oxford University. And he was brought out of retirement in 1979 in the aftermath of the Warren Point ambush, where 18 soldiers were killed. And of course, the killing of Lord Mountbatten that day. The British government were seeking someone who could coordinate intelligence and the efforts against the Provisional IRA, and he was the person that they picked. So they brought him out of retirement, and he became a security coordinator at Stormont, because it was thought that coordination, not just within the security forces, but also between the British and the Irish governments, was not quite up to the standard that was required to meet the challenge posed by this very, violent organisation.
So infiltration was one of the ways, and I guess they'd learned that in other kinds of places around the world as part of the strategy in which they could disrupt and destroy from within. Charlie in Carador wonders, Aaron, just how much credence can you give the recollections of some of these shadowy figures? He says it's all made up fiction in some cases, surely. How do you know what to believe and what not to believe?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm very conscious of that. In fact, I learned this the very hard way with the book on the UVF. But here's the thing. With this project, I could rely on official government sources as well. I was very interested to see what the British government had released into the National Archives, for example. Not an awful lot. There's a paucity of information on intelligence matters. However, I used the Freedom of Information Act to extract information, to have information declassified, so I could see for myself whether some of these agents or people who claim to be sources of information, secret intelligence, had passed anything valuable on. So, and what I did in some cases, I was able to triangulate that with, of course, the written record and what historians like me do in terms of our scholarly research, which the general public wouldn't read. That, where it is peer reviewed, where we are held to a high standard of professionalism. So I tried as far as possible to triangulate the different sources, because the individuals...
No, I understand what you're saying. You try to corroborate. You try to corroborate it with documents and other kinds of agents, former agents yourself, and you can point out as you go the level of confidence you have in what they're saying. David wonders how infiltrated the Republican movement more generally was. Can you walk us through it? What was the level of influence by these agents?
Well, this is highly controversial and contested, and it's impossible to know. I mean, one thing that we will never find anywhere in an archive is a list of agents, so we can only really speculate. And a number of journalists and academics have done this before. But what I can say with a high degree of confidence in all of the research that I've done for agents of influence is that the Republican movement, like other organizations, they're not the only grouping or movement that has been infiltrated, but they were infiltrated at all levels, from the top to the bottom, and all departments, all aspects of the organization, as indeed loyalist paramilitaries were as well.
You tell us in the book that British intelligence managed to infiltrate the inner circles of the IRA and the circles around then senior IRA commander Martin McGuinness with agents. Tell us more.
So Martin McGuinness, obviously, because of the prominent position he held within provisional republicanism, was a top intelligence target, and so the organisation that he presided over and people around him were essential to assisting the British spymasters in understanding two things. One, the nature of the organisation that he presided over, and two, the psychology of the man himself. And I found that Martin McGuinness was a very complex character, and I certainly do not put in the book, I do not portray Martin McGuinness as a one-dimensional character. I think that the time for understanding individuals involved in militancy by just looking at their public character or what people have said about them is not an exact science. So it's important to look at them from all aspects. But what
what was Martin McGuinness's relationship with the MI6 officer Michael Oatley?
So Willie Carlin claims that he spotted Martin McGuinness coming out of a meeting with Michael Oatley. He alleges this in and around the time of the hunger strikes. And although has been said that Martin McGuinness had been given sanction in order to engage with the British on the issue of the hunger strikes, and this has been brought out in a number of other books. The eyewitness testimony, though, if you look at it in the context of what happens 10 years later, Martin McGuinness is certainly engaging with Michael Oatley in 1990, 1991. And so we see the origins of the peace process there a decade later. But that relationship goes back. No one quite knows how far back, but certainly back to 1980, 1981.
Willie Collins says that he doesn't obviously believe Martin McGuinness was a spy. He makes that clear. He thinks that Martin McGuinness was authorised by the IRA to open lines of communication.
That's correct. However, I think it's important to also point out that I've talked to a broad range of political persuasions and viewpoints, including those who are, still members of Sinn Féin and so on, and also those who have walked away from that movement. And what I found is that those people who have walked away from Sinn Féin and may have been in the Provisional IRA, they ask really difficult questions about Martin McGuinness, and they're questions that your listeners will be able to examine themselves in the book. But certainly there's a lot of suspicion that comes not just from former members of the security forces and former agents, but also from within republicanism and the Republican family itself, which is very intriguing. But historians can only go so far in retelling this story.
On the explosive revelations, what's the most revealing new bit of information you have for us, Aaron?
Well, I think that there are a number of revelations in the book. One that, the amount of information that the British had on the IRA was just quite remarkable. They also obviously were in a position to manipulate, the formation of Sinn Féin, the establishment of Sinn Féin as a political party, and they were able to use individuals within the army bit, the Provisional IRA, to essentially run down the military campaign themselves. So I think that what we're seeing is a lot more of a nuanced interpretation of exactly what happened, particularly in the 1980s. I don't want to talk about individuals specifically who have been outed as spies or alleged spies. People can read about those individuals in my book.
So are you suggesting that the British government was using agents to pull the strings, both in terms of the IRA's military strategy and the development of Sinn Féin's political strategy?
Well, I think certainly encouraging politics at the expense of militarism is something that comes out in the documentation and indeed in the interviews I've done. That would be, it's contested, but that would be my interpretation of the evidence that I have examined closely.
Do you have evidence that any of these moles, agents, spies were used to murder people?
I mean, again, this is very, very controversial. And I do talk about the allegations in the book. And I think that it would be right, really, just to refer people back to what I say in the book. I think that I am not a legal professional by any stretch of the imagination. So certainly it would not be appropriate for me to go into that in any great depth, because it requires a level of speculation that I just haven't engaged in. It also requires a level of legal training that I don't have.
So are you saying you don't have evidence that spies were used in collusion or even directly in other ways to attack people, to assassinate, to be involved in any kind of criminal activity?
Well, what I can report is that when I've asked this question of the, spy masters themselves, intelligence officers, I've been told that agents were a passive tool by which to extract information, and that they would certainly not have been in any way directed to engage in any kind of illegal activity. But this is an ongoing controversy, and so that is as far as I could get. I mean, I can only ask people. And certainly there are suspicions of people being involved in that kind of criminal activity. But apart from a few...
If not direct organisation, what about looking away and knowing that it was happening? If you're telling us that the British military organisations were incredibly informed, you even say that they were reading some Army Council documents before they were circulated to people within the Republican movement or the Army Council members. If they were so well informed, how could they not be informed if agents were engaging in acts of killing, for example?
Well, this comes back to the psychology, not only of those engaged in terrorism, but also the agents themselves. I mean, a lot of these individuals were working in highly pressurized environments. And so I don't think that certainly some of them were telling their handlers everything that had been going on. And of course, herein lies the rub. So I think it's ethically, these questions must be asked.
They should be asked, because if these agents are to have any credibility within movements like the IRA, you would think they have to do things that would be problematic for legal reasons, but nevertheless establish their credibility in the organizations.
Sure. So I think that the autonomy that these agents had, rather than direct control, is something that must be looked at in greater detail. I certainly looked at this book not just from the point of view of the agents. They were at the very apex of this intelligence attack against the IRA, but also the work of the uniformed security forces in collecting a lot of information. You'll see in the book how that information was put to use, and essentially affecting arrests and preventing a lot of terrorist attacks. So, but it was an imperfect science, as indeed I refer to it in a final chapter in the book.
Marie would like to know from Twitter, if the IRA was so infiltrated, as you say, why did the conflict last quite as long as it did?
That's a great question. And in fact, it is a question that I've been examining for many years, and not just in relation to this book. And I do hear, people when they say that to me, specifically because I've written a book on this. But I think that there's only so much that these intelligence assets could do. There's only so much a human intelligence can offer. I mean, ultimately, this was a conflict that was brought to an end politically, and for the political music to be right, that can take a long time. And these intelligence assets, these agents, play a very, very small role in that.
Which agent would you say got to the highest, to the deepest, the most penetrating dimension of republicanism?
Well, that's an open question, I think, because really, as I've said already, the organisations are still active, and indeed there could very well be members still left behind enemy lines.
Agents still reporting?
There could well be.
Could well be, or do you have evidence suggesting there may be?
Well, I think that public inquiries have revealed that a lot of these groups have still, channels of information within them that continue and have continued beyond the 1997 period that I look at. I look at the period 1979 to 1997, and it's speculation, of course, at this point.
Have there been agents of influence who didn't know they were agents?
Yes, this is an intriguing aspect of it. I think that, and one of the Republicans that I interviewed, he talks about intelligence assets and intelligence agents. I think assets are people who unwittingly give information, whereas agents are a bit more active in the giving of information. So I think that people we know this through open source intelligence techniques pioneered by the likes of Bellingcat these days, that people can unwittingly give away information in a variety of ways.
Some of these agents were very important to British military intelligence. So a couple of people, including Robert here, are asking if it ever came to the point where, in order to protect those agents, sacrifices had to be made of security forces.
That's a very controversial question, and in fact, it was something that I investigated in relation to the book. But here's the thing: I could only rely on the information that was given to me, and I think those questions need to be asked by other people, and certainly they have been asked in relation to with the public inquiries that have been ongoing for some time. I couldn't possibly comment on that in any great depth because I didn't see any evidence of it in my own research.
Given your experience of that world as you progress through it with the help of some of these former agents and the documents and piecing it all together, would it surprise you if that happened?
Well, anything is possible, I guess, but I think that people in the past operated ethically in the same way that they did today, and I would like to think that that was the case. Certainly, that kind of information. You don't think that might be
slightly naive, Aaron?
Well, I think that what people would say in relation to those years, because I have talked to the former intelligence officers who worked for the RUC, for example, they would say, well, it was a grey area. So beyond that, what more information can I get from them? I mean, clearly things went on where they would say that there were no legal processes in place, and so judgments had to be made on a fairly intense, time pressured, time limited way. So who knows? I'm sure all of this will come out in future public inquiries, if indeed there are any.
Well, if indeed there are any, or it might come out in 100 years' time, who knows? Final question from me, Aaron. Do you think the agents of influence system as it was operated shortened the conflict in Northern Ireland or prolonged it?
I think it played an important role in bringing about the end of the Troubles, but no more of an important role than, say, the efforts of those people who practiced restraint, preached restraint within their own political organisations and paramilitary organisations, or indeed the uniformed security forces.
Aaron, thank you very much. Fascinating world, shadowy world. We can only get into so much of it, as you've just heard from Aaron Edwards and his answers. His book is titled Agents of Influence, Britain's Secret Intelligence War Against the IRA. That is it from us. Thanks for your text, tweets and calls. We will see you tomorrow. Here's Hugo.